everyone hear me now? This is Christina.
Yes, I hear you.
Fantastic.
Yes,
Sorry, we're back to using the old-fashioned telephone, so good thing for that, right?
Or not only a Gmail?
Okay. Well, we start again, and I'm going to repeat the introduction because we had some sort of a sound situation in the midst of it. My apologies for the delay, and we're going to continue on, and hopefully everything has been solved. So thank you to our technical folks, John and Avneet, for working on this. Okay, so I want to welcome all of you today to our webinar, How to Mitigate Child Labor in the Supply Chain. My name is Christina Bain, and I'm the Director of the Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery at Babson College, and I'm thrilled to be co-sponsoring these webinars with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, who does tremendous work on all of these issues and fighting transnational organized crime globally each and every day. I especially want to thank our sponsors today, Denton's Global LLP, which is the largest global worldwide law firm, and they have a really dynamic corporate social responsibility and entrepreneurship department. They're doing tremendous pro bono work on human trafficking and modern slavery, and I really encourage you to check out their website, www.dentons.com, and see all of their exciting efforts on a variety of issues. I also want to thank the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University, especially to Dr. Louise Shelley, who's actually testifying before Congress on financing terrorist networks and issues related to that. So we want to wish her the best of luck today with her testimony. And also Casey Crenard, who does a tremendous job in promoting these webinars to all of their lists and all of their partners. And their website is track.gmu.edu. I want to give you a brief overview of the Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery at Babson College. Together, we're bringing entrepreneurial minds, students and business leaders, corporate, NGO, and governmental partners, and human trafficking and modern slavery activists from across the globe in order to learn, network, and build innovative approaches to advancing human freedom. We're also leveraging expertise and resources from the college to develop cutting-edge resource, classroom approaches, and action-oriented initiatives to educate and activate current and next-generation business leaders in the fight against human trafficking and modern slavery. We're also doing some really interesting initiatives in local area secondary schools here in the United States, and teaching students how to create business solutions to solve human trafficking and inspiring them to create their own businesses as they go on in their career. For more information on the program, you can go to www.babson.edu/IHTMS. And before we get into our formal presentations and our moderated program, I want to introduce my colleague, Olivia Wagner, who's the private sector advisor for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, who's going to tell us about their extraordinary work with the initiative. Olivia?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Christina, for your introduction. And greetings from Paris, from the OECD Conference on Responsible Mineral Supply Chains. I would like to introduce very briefly the Global Initiative. And as you may know, the Global Initiative is a network that was formally launched in September 2013, and it's a network of more than 100 independent global regional experts working on law enforcement, human rights, democracy, governments and development issues. And we're registered as a non-profit civil society organization in Geneva, in Switzerland. And our objectives from the global initiatives are threefold. The first one is strategic. That means we want to promote more and joined up responses. And secondly, analytical. That means we want to raise awareness and also open the the nature, the extent, and the impact and solutions of organized crime. So, but we don't want to be the last response, because we want to serve as a source partner with regional and national and international players, of course. And our substantive priorities, we focus on these forms of organized crime that you can see here. And I work on human trafficking, but also covering issues of illegal mining and organized crime related to that issues. The genesis of the global initiative is that the GI was conceived after a series of closed forum discussions with senior law enforcement officials and also experts from multilateral organizations and institutions and policymakers, because there was simply the demand, or they called for a network which serves as a necessary tool to develop a more strategic and more global approach to counter organized crime, because organized crime is so complex that you also have to have a very complex response to that, including all the different members. So what we're now looking at the global initiative and the activities in human trafficking is that you can find all the publications on our website. It's globalinitiative.net, where you can find the research report called Smuggled Futures, and also our latest in-depth study on illegal gold mining in Latin America, where we also look into the issue of human trafficking. So, and we very much recognize the importance of engaging with non-state actors, especially with partners from the private sector, to broaden the debate and to include all the different stakeholder groups. Yeah, thank you very much. That's it from us, from the Global Initiative, and we're very happy and excited for this very interesting webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Livia, and thank you for the amazing work that you do each and every day with the Global Initiative. So now I just want to have a brief technical overview, since we've had some other technical challenges this morning. I just want to make sure everyone sees the text chat box on the right-hand side of their screen. This is where we're going to be communicating. If you continue to have any challenges or issues related to the sound or any technical piece of the online event, please text us here and we will solve it as quickly as we can. In addition, as we begin the conversation and the discussion with our presenters, please start to send in your questions in the text chat box. We'll be monitoring that throughout the online event. So as the speakers present and we begin the session, please send those questions in to the text chat box on the right. And again, if you have any challenges or can't find the text chat box, please let us know and we can sort that out as well. Okay, so now we're going to begin our discussion on the topic today, which is child labor and how to mitigate child labor in the supply chain. This is the fourth in the series that we've had that we're co-hosting with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and we are focusing this series on supply chains, human trafficking in the private sector, and we're thrilled to be doing this series again this year after our launch last year. Or last academic year in 2014-2015. And now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Tuesday Reitano, my wonderful colleague from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. She has a wonderful bio. In addition to being the head of the Secretariat at the Global Initiative, she's a senior research advisor at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, where she leads 5 organized crime observatories in Africa. She's also worked on worked for an independent policy and monitoring unit as the director of CT Morse for the EU's programs in counterterrorism, and as a policy specialist in the UN system, including with the UN Development Program, the UN Development Group, and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. She's also the lead author of a forthcoming OECD flagship publication, Illicit Financial Flows, Criminal Economies in West Africa. In addition, she's also going to be authoring another publication on the current migrant crisis in Europe, so we're on the lookout for that. She also holds 3 master's degrees in business administration, an MBA, public administration, and an MSc in security, conflict, and international development. She's based in Beirut, Lebanon, with her family. Welcome, Tuesday, as our moderator today.
Thank you so much, Christina. I think you missed a career in marketing there, and your sales pitches are always superb and very embarrassing. Thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this session. As Christina said, I'm the head of the Secretariat at the Global Initiative, which is one of the co-sponsors of the webinars. For us, this is a very important series where we are trying to move forward with very tangible and practical guidance, good practices, and example that focus on how the private sector can respond to a range of human trafficking challenges. As Christina explained, our series this year focuses on supply chain integrity and supply chain management. For the 4th in this series, we have focused down on the issue of child labor. I'm sure all of you, being informed audience and presenters, know that this is a significant global problem, that it is estimated around 168 million children globally are working in child labor situations, more than half of them in hazardous sectors, doing hazardous work, which is damaging both to their health, as well as having typically rather negative consequences for the environment. What we have on offer today is 3 panelists representing different sectors, and it is our goal very much to see how the different sectors can interplay together. We have a representative from government, one from the non-governmental sector, and a colleague who is representing a private sector coalition, all of which are actively focusing on improving supply chain integrity. Because we want to be able to get down to specifics and not talk in generalities, and to provide the kinds of examples that show practical application of new approaches, we're focusing down in the discussion predominantly on the cocoa industry. The cocoa industry and the agricultural sector are by far the most important sector where child laborers and child trafficking can be found. It's estimated around 60%, 98 million children work in the agricultural sector, though it is not by any means not present in others also. And certainly in the service industry and in manufacturing, these are quite serious and acute problems. 54 million children are thought to work in the service industry informally. And these are generally informal economy activities. So then we're seeing the kinds of consequences, and for those of you who tuned into our last webinar, we're seeing very severe consequences of having these unregulated industries working in the informal sector. So we end up discussing a range of issues, both social protection in relation to the children themselves, as well as improving the supply chain and the ability of companies to deliver services in a way that's sustainable and generally in line with human rights and development standards. I am not going to take up any more time, and very much pleased to introduce our 3 speakers. We have with us today Pilar Velasquez from the U.S. International Labor Affairs Department in the Human Trafficking and International Labor Affairs Bureau at the U.S. Department of Labor. We are also joined by Olivier Laboulle, who is a program manager for the Sustainable Supply Chain Management of the International Cocoa Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative to improve regulation and monitor and remediate child labor in the West African cocoa farms. And we have Antonie Fountain, who's the managing director of the Voice Network, which is again a civil society advocacy organization looking at the cocoa sector to try and improve sustainable production. We will hear from them in that order. So with little further delay, I will pass you over to Pilar, or I think Christina will pass you over to Pilar, who will be giving her presentation, which will look more broadly at the issue of child labor and forced labor in multiple countries. She and her bureau look not only at the cocoa industry, but will give a more general introduction, which also looks at child labor in the mining sector. Pilar, over to you.
Thank you for the invitation, and it's great to be here with everybody today to talk about child labor and supply chain. First, let me say that I work in the Bureau of International Labor Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor. We are the international arm of the department, and we work to promote labor rights globally. These include working on child labor in supply chain. We focus our work on 4 main areas. So, I don't see my presentation, sorry. Okay, great. Okay, so we focus our work on 4 main areas. The first one is we implement mandates established by law. We fund projects to promote labor rights globally. We develop and disseminate tools to promote responsible businesses. We engage with different stakeholders to promote labor rights. I'm going to discuss each of these areas quickly. So the first one has to do with implement mandates established by law, by the Trade and Development Act of 2000. We are required to publish an annual report on efforts to eliminate the workforce of child labor. This report includes information for 140 countries. These countries receive trade preference by the U.S. This report includes information about the prevalence of the workforce of child labor per each country, includes also suggestions for government action and individual country assessments. This report is available on our website. And one thing that I wanted to mention is that we focus on the workforce of child labor, and that has to do with the implementation of the International Labor Convention 182. And we use the definition included in these conventions. So according to the convention, first, we define children to be a person under the age of 18, and we include the workforce of child labor in our reports and in our work in general, or forms of slavery. So that includes child trafficking, that bondage, child recruitment. It also includes children engaged in commercial sexual exploitation, children involved in illegal activities, and also one thing then for us is important is work which by its nature could harm children's health, safety, and morals. And this is really important because according to the ILO, there are 85 million children engaged in hazardous work or the workforce of child labor. So when we talk about workforce of child labor, we are talking about children who work in mines, children who use pesticides, children who use chemicals like mercury, or children who pick trash on the streets. We are mandated by law by the Trafficking Victims Protection and Reauthorization Act of 2005 to develop a list of goods from countries produced by child labor or forced labor. This list, we publish this list every 2 years, and the 2014 TV parallel list included 138 products or goods. And I wanted to show you this graphic because it provides really good information about the number of goods listed by sector. So if you see this graphic, so you will see that most of the goods are related to agriculture. So one of the things then in that list we include is in agricultural goods like cotton, like sugar cane, like coffee, like tobacco, like cocoa, and other products. And if you see in second place has to do with manufacturing. So these are related to children who are involved in garments and making bricks or in carpets. And we have 8 goods related to mining. It could be mining has to do with gold, with coal, and other kinds. And one of the things that I think is important when you see this graphic is also to realize that when we talk about child labor and the workforce of child labor in general, we are talking about that is something that is happening in different countries and different continents. We also, as mentioned earlier, we fund projects to improve labor rights, and in this case, to reduce child labor. So since 1995, we have been funding 300 projects in 90 countries. And this is important to mention because we are supporting efforts to address this issue. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that through these projects, we have been providing educational and vocational opportunities to more than 2 million children. Through this project, we provide livelihood opportunities for families vulnerable to child labor. And also, we have been working in many countries, helping them to increase their capacity to address child labor. And that means like helping countries to adopt and implement laws, policies, and programs. These projects are implemented by international organizations, international NGOs. We are currently funding a lot of projects, and there are sector-specific projects. And here, this table it gives you an idea of where and what sector we are focusing on. So as you see, we are funding a project in Afghanistan that focus on carpets. So this project works to help make carpets without child labor. We are funding a project in Colombia that combats child labor in coal and gold mining. We are supporting 2 projects in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. Then they focus on the cocoa sector. We support the efforts to eradicate the workforce of child labor in both countries. We fund projects in Haiti, in Honduras, in Liberia, the Philippines, Turkey, etc. And one of the things that is important is that our work is to support efforts, is to work with different actors. We feel that is working together, then we will be able to eradicate child labor. We develop and disseminate tools to promote responsible businesses. So you can see here, we develop an online tool for companies. So to provide information about the steps to a social compliance system. Through this tool provides a general overview of what is needed. So it has really good information, and we encourage businesses and also industry groups to use it. And also, we want to know whether different businesses are having any experiences and having any information that they would like to share with us. In addition to this, and as I mentioned earlier, we engage. We feel like we're only going to be able to eradicate child labor if we work together. And one of the things that we do is that we participate in different regional and international forums, like the International Labor Conference, the G20, the G7, and other venues. We engage in bilateral labor dialogues with other countries to exchange information on child labor and also on forced labor. We engage with companies, with industry groups, with civil society organizations, with academics, to discuss child labor and to be able to work together. One of the things that I wanted to mention here as an example of what we are doing, we at this moment, we are currently funding 3 projects to combat child labor in gold mining. As mentioned, so we have a project in Colombia, we also have a project in Burkina Faso, and now we have a new global project. And one of the ideas of having this new project is to promote networks, because we feel that this is the only way how we could tackle this issue. And through the project and also through our direct interaction with different actors. So we promote actions specific, like for instance, we work with governments to promote actions to address child labor and working conditions and artisanal and small scale mining. We work with other government, U.S. government agencies on this issue. We have been working with mining companies and organizations that work on artisanal and small scale gold mining. One thing that I think is important to mention that we believe that addressing child labor involves some things that are key to us. One is increasing knowledge of child labor to mobilize actors and guide actions. Second is enforce laws and regulations to address child labor and monitoring child labor in supply chains. Third, we think that it's important to foster partnerships among governments, in the private sector, working organizations, local communities, and on other actors to conduct actions. We think then also it's important to include parents, children in the areas where a child labor is prevalent. We believe in promoting job formalization and livelihood opportunities in communities where child labor is prevalent. And I wanted to share with you that we engaged through a new app. We have, last year, we launched a new app, Sweet and Toil. This app provides really good information about the reports. And you could download this app through iTunes or the Play Store, or even going to our website. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Pilar. That was a very clear overview, and it's great to see how many, the range of initiatives and the range of stakeholders that you engage with in your work. As a global initiative, we of course love to hear about networks, and I think unquestionably in issues like this, it is the way forward. In order to leave plenty of time for questions, since we did start late, we'll go straight on to the next presentation, if that's okay, and then have a chance to take a round of questions at the end. Olivier, I'm going to turn over to you next. We are very pleased to have you here today. Olivier is, as I said, the Program Manager for Sustainable Supply Chain Management with the International COCO Initiative. Before joining the COCO Initiative, he worked in UNESCO for a number of years, and previous to that had worked with a range of non-profits and private-public partnerships looking at different sustainability issues, education and livelihoods in Africa and Europe. Olivier, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you. I think my presentation is now being seen. Yes. So thank you very much for having ICI and having me today presenting. I'll try to run fairly quickly through the introduction because we don't have very much time necessarily. But ICI is a, and I'm not sure I can skip to the next slide actually. I don't see the little, the little icon next to my presentation. Christina, would you know, or could someone just press next slide when? Oh, that's working. Sorry.
Olivier,
yeah, that's fine.
Now, okay, great.
Yes, sorry.
Let us know if you need further help.
No, that's okay. Thank you. So just very briefly, ICI is not actually a private entity necessarily. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative, and as you can see here in the inner circle, it's composed by, on the left-hand side, industry, chocolate manufacturers, and cocoa suppliers, and on the right-hand side, NGOs, international organizations such as the ILO, Free the Slaves, Solidaridad, and we work with a wider number of stakeholders, other industry sectors, certifiers, the media obviously, and we're trying to work on child labor in the West African cocoa sector. The 2015-2010 strategy of ICI has three main pillars, and I will not go into too much detail. You're most welcome to have a look on our website. Just to mention them, we have child-centered community development, and ICI just won a bid actually from US Door, one of the projects that was mentioned by Pilar earlier, to work with 50 communities in the cocoa growing areas of Côte d'Ivoire, to work with community leadership and trying to raise the awareness on child labor, work with them on community action plans and the rehabilitation of certain social infrastructure to basically create an environment that is more enabling to child protection. At the bottom, you have influencing and capacity building. This is basically ICI being a platform for learning and influencing the strategy of other organizations as well. And on the top right-hand side, you have responsible supply chain management, which is the area I work on, with certification, with organizations such as the Voice Network of Antonie, and also working with chocolate manufacturers such as Nestlé on the child labor monitoring and remediation system. Just a few concepts on that, and to start by saying that human rights and supply chain is a very trendy topic at the moment for the past 5 years or so, and certainly with the issuing of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, we've seen a lot of effort being put into that area. You had some USDA guidelines before. OECD FAO have recently also issued some guidelines. The UK Modern Slavery Act was recently as well adopted in the United Kingdom, yes. And then this year's ILO conference is on decent work in supply chain. So this is really something that more and more people are engaged with. And the reason for that is, and all these guidelines go towards the same conclusions and recommendations, is the fact that as a company, you can't just get away anymore with saying, I know that in some of the contexts in which I operate, there are some human rights violations, but I'm not directly responsible. Therefore, I build a few schools and look at the pictures, here it is. More and more consumers, campaigners are actually asking the bigger companies to take their share of responsibility and to go beyond their own just initial direct impact to try to see what leverage do they have to influence situations that are outside their direct responsibility. So it means as well going towards a complete picture of their business relationship and not just saying, I have an agreement with my tier one supplier, but what happens further down the supply chain is not my business. Consumers now want to know that that's not the case and that communities can be traced all the way until the producer level. And once that's done, people, companies, business enterprises are asked to conduct ongoing risk assessment and monitoring that takes place even at the farm level, and then put in place some remediation plans and activities and collect data to publicly report on their efforts and their findings. Why a child labor monitoring and remediation system, in short CLMRS, in the cocoa supply chain? Well, first of all, and Pilar has mentioned that child labor remains an extremely concerning problem in the cocoa sector, with more than 2 million estimated child laborers in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And also because previously, while certification was seen as sort of a solution to address child labor, we've seen, and certainly with Nestlé since 2012, and an assessment that was conducted in their organized certified supply chain, that despite certification at cooperative level, widespread child labor was found, which means that when the auditor for the certification came once a year and asked if there were children involved, everybody was saying no. But if you go a bit deeper, you realize that actually this is just hiding the problem. And that had to do, maybe, among others, with the fact that the approach was very much punitive as opposed to supportive. That is, if a farmer is likely to lose its certification premium by disclosing the fact that his children are involved in some hazardous activities, it's less likely that he will basically report on this and take action. So the idea was to take a more supportive approach as well. So based on those recommendations, ICI, together with Nestlé, set up this CLMRS to identify and address child labor in their cocoa supply chain. Now, the way it works, and I'd like to start with the fact that, as you can see, Nestlé, being the manufacturer here, is not in direct business relationship with the farmers down the line, down the supply chain, and that there is several different suppliers in between. So it means that Nestlé, with their suppliers, with the cooperatives, and under sort of the management and coordination of ICI, has set up community facilitators in each one of these communities. The second step is once those have been identified, they're being trained and equipped with cell phones and everything they need to be able to basically monitor child labor at farm levels within their peers, within their communities. Once this is done, they basically conduct interviews and ask their neighbors and their co-farmers what their activities are, how their children are being engaged or not. This is all transferred to an ICI managed database and then further communicated back down the chain. And lastly, based on this information, remediation strategies and further monitoring is then conducted. And this is how the system basically works. Now, I'd like to share with you some of the findings that we've been able to generate thanks to this system based on 18,000 farmers and more than 4,000 children identified to be involved in hazardous activities from last year. The data is from July 2015, because this is very important as well for the understanding. And if you remember, the role of ICI is not just to go on the ground and implement and bring children back to school, but also to generate learning and to feed that back to the industry for their own activities and to broader smallholder farming sectors in other commodities as well. The first one, and that's also a little bit maybe in contradiction with the introduction that I've received for the webinar on paper, that very much has this vision of child labor being related to trafficking. But in sub-Saharan Africa, in the cocoa sector, on smallholder farms, it's mainly on your family farm, and a child is being asked to work on a Saturday to help, sometimes after school. And as you can see on these graphs, 67% of all the children of our co-op members in the system are actually in school. So just saying we'll bring the children back to school doesn't necessarily prevent them from being identified as child laborer. The way we identify child laborer, by the way, is back to what Pilar was describing as well, is the hazardous tasks. So we consider that if a child is using pesticides or is carrying heavy weight, this is the type of activities that would for us be considered as child labor, and we're not so much going into the longer hours that could be detrimental to the education at the moment, because it's much more complicated to measure and basically very difficult to operationalize. But based on this methodology and our 18,000 farmers groups, we found 19% of the children aged 5 to 17 were involved in some of those activities that are deemed dangerous by the Ivorian government. Out of those 19%, 90% were actually, so 9 in 10 children that we identified to be involved in hazardous activities was involved in carrying heavy weight. And we are conducting further investigation in this, because actually we realized through talking with our staff on the ground and the community facilitators that that's not necessarily related as well to the cocoa harvest and carrying cocoa beans, but it might just be bringing back cooking wood, burning wood from the farm on a Saturday again or after school. And that's something that one doesn't necessarily immediately put in relation to child labor in the way we always see the worst forms of child labor as something that's absolutely to be stopped on the spot. But those practices are very difficult to target when the child is involved in carrying heavy weight as part of his family duties, and cooperative members, farmers, don't necessarily realize the impact it can have on the child's body at different ages. I'm going very quickly through the last slides because I'm already going over time a little bit. You can see here again really the over proportion of heavy loads as opposed to bush burning, agrochemicals, falling trees, hunting, that are the other hazardous tasks in Côte d'Ivoire. The age of child laborers is also something that we found very interesting, because child laborers are a bit older than maybe one has in mind. We think about primary age school children, but what about the 15 to 17? Those are children that have already completed some of them their primary education, and they don't necessarily have any further learning opportunities where they are. They're starting to get engaged on farms with neighbors, and that's a much more complex issue to address than to just bring back an 8-year-old to school, for example. And then finally, just to give you an example of the type of remediation that we then use, it is mainly awareness raising. Sometimes it's just really enough to tell a cocoa farmer, have you thought about the consequences of that practice on your child? And that will really do the trick. But sometimes it's more related to livelihood and the lack of income, in which case we will try to develop some income generating activities for the household. Obviously educational support in the case that that's the main issues, school canteens, birth certificate and technical vocational education and training for all the children. So in a nutshell, those are the issues in cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire and the way that ICI together with Nestlé has addressed it as part of our CLMRS along the supply chain. So thank you very much for your attention.
Olivier, thank you very much for coming here and taking the time to tell us about your initiative. Sounds fabulous. Really always good to see the range of ways that it is possible to communicate with the people engaged in trafficking, and the point is well taken that this is often an informal industry, an important livelihood issue where maybe everybody has the same interest in social protection. So thank you very much for that. I now pass over to Antonie Fountain. Antonie, you are the Managing Director at the Voice Network, right? And we look forward to hearing you tell us what the Voice Network is and does.
Great. Let me just turn on my camera so that you guys can see me. If you are surprised that you can hear birds chirping while I speak, this is true. My office is a very little caravan out in the woods, so you can see that behind me. It's glorious weather and the birds are singing. So quick short introduction of who we are at Voice before we go into some of the more content-based things. Voice is a network, an association of trade unions and civil society organizations working specifically on cocoa. Since cocoa is a globally organized industry with a lot of concentration in just a couple of countries, a lot of concentration in just a couple of companies. However, these companies work on a global level, and so when a civil society you want to be able to influence the sector, then you cannot just do that within the confines of your national boundaries. You really do need to work together on a global level. So that's where Voice started about six and a half years ago. What we do is we primarily, it started with internal information sharing, because together we know more than individually apart. And through that information sharing, we started to come to the point where we started to realize, well, you know, what are then the highest prioritizations? And so we started prioritizing the issues for ourselves, but also towards the rest. So that's come down to the point that now we are an advocacy and research organization. So we don't do any on-the-ground work in Côte d'Ivoire or in Ghana or anywhere else, although some of our members do. We do quite a lot of different things. Now, I just saw that I've got the ball here. So can you guys see my slide presentation?
Yes, I think you're, yes, okay. You're the first slide.
Great. So that's me. Boring. We can skip that. We'll get to kind of who are we. So our members are 9 different organizations in various different countries. Stop the Trafficker Global Campaigning Organization Against Human Trafficking. ABVV FGTB Horval, which is a Belgian trade union, and FNV, which is a Dutch trade union. Oxfam Wereldwinkels in Belgium, Oxfam Novib in the Netherlands, Südwind Research Institute in Germany, Bern Declaration in Switzerland, and since several weeks, but I've not gotten around to putting them on our logo field yet, a organization in Berlin called COTE. So that's who we are, that's what we do, research and advocacy, where we try to bring forward the conversation. We see it as our role to be a watchdog and a catalyst on the issues that are necessary. Since the very beginning, we've been involved in the child labor conversation. Since the beginning of the network and myself, I've spent the last decade working on child labor, specifically in the cocoa sector. Now, I want to take you down kind of almost a history of engagement of the sector. Just very quickly, I'm going to do that. Definitions. First of all, it's important to know what are we talking about. When bringing up the topic of child labor on farms, a lot of people will often say, but I grew up on a farm as well, I had to help out as well. Is that child labor as well? No, that's basically child work, which, as you can see on the screen, I've put in green because child work is it's okay, it's normal, it's actually part of farm life, where after school, when it's not in the way of your development as a child, it's not in the way of your education, you sometimes have to help out on the farm. I grew up on a farm. I sometimes had to help as well. There's no problem there at all. Now, it becomes problematic when you start talking about child labor, which falls under the ILO Core Convention 138. The ILO, the International Labor Organization of the United Nations, has 8 core conventions, 8 basic fundamental labor rights, so to speak, 2 of which deal with child labor. The regular child labor one is ILO 138, which basically encompasses any kind of labor that is in the way of the proper development of the child. So labor that that gets in the way of your schooling, education, and things like that. But it also can mean that child labor has more, which is why at a certain moment the ILO came up with the second core convention on child labor within the ILO, which is Convention 182, which is on the worst forms of child labor. Now, the worst forms of child labor are not just kinds of child labor that get in the way of your education or your childhood, but that are actually also detrimental to the health of the child, either mentally or physically or spiritually. And within that, there is a distinction between the conditional worst forms of child labor and the unconditional worst forms of child labor. Conditional worst forms of child labor are worst forms of child labor that require national government legislation to define what is meant by that. So within that, you've got to look at the national governments will have to, after ratifying Core Convention 182, will have to come up with, for example, specific age limits for the maximum weight that a child can carry to fall under the definition of conditional worst forms of child labor, which kinds of activities are hazardous, which kinds aren't. And that already brings us to a tricky, complicated situation because, for example, in Ghana, it is considered a conditional worst form of child labor if a child uses a machete. In Cote d'Ivoire, this is not the case. So that also brings in some complexity sometimes when you're measuring issues around child labor. So in Ghana, using a machete would fall under ILO Convention 182. In Cote d'Ivoire, using a machete as a child would not fall under 182, but usually under 138. Now then there's a fourth level here after work, child labor, and the conditional worst forms of child labor. There's the unconditional worst forms of child labor. Now that is what we often talk about when we're talking about trafficking and supply chains. Unconditional worst forms of child labor are when there is trafficking, when there's forced labor, when the child is forced into prostitution, into drug dealing, and or the sale and harvesting of organs. So the unconditional worst forms of child labor, one could say this is a hierarchy of things. Now, I think it's important to put this in place before we go into some more of the details, because it also will show some of the challenges we get to later. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the industry's engagement, and not just the industry, but the whole sector over the last 10, 15 years. I'm going to do this using Monty Python's Silly Olympics. Now, I'm not sure if you have ever seen Monty Python and the Silly Olympics, but Monty Python's Silly Olympics are people doing very silly sports races, and one of them is the 100-meter sprint for people that are deaf. The starting gun has gone off, and you see everyone at the line, and the starting gun goes off, and nobody actually moves because they obviously didn't hear the starting signal. Now, that is kind of what child labor and trafficking in the cocoa sector felt like way in the beginning. And with way in the beginning, I'm talking about the year 2000, 2001. There was a lot of media attention all of a sudden about the trafficking of children in the cocoa sector, about the worst forms of child labor in the cocoa sector, and that led to a potential legislative change in the United States, which got passed in the House, but before it got passed in the Senate, the industry said, guys, we can't have this bill turn into law. We are going to voluntarily promise to end trafficking and the worst forms of child labor in the cocoa sector by 2005. The problem is that after that, it seems like the gun had gone off, but nobody moved. And so for the first 4 or 5 years or so of this so-called Harkin-Engel Protocol, named after Senator Tom Harkin and Representative Elliot Engel, for the first 5 years of the Harkin-Engel Protocol, everyone just stood at the starting line way after the gun had gone off, and they didn't do very much at all. And at a certain moment, we started coming towards the second Monty Python sketch of the Seal Olympics, and you can see the picture of that sketch here, which is the 100-meter sprint for people with absolutely no sense of direction. So the gun goes off, and everybody runs in different directions. Now, I would say this started happening somewhere around 2007. People started to realize that they were going to run out of cocoa within the next 10, 15 years if nothing was done. The average age of cocoa farmers is very close to the average life expectancy of the cocoa farmer. Young people don't want to be growing cocoa anymore. The trees are getting very old. They're becoming very susceptible to crop diseases and things like that. There is actually a danger that we're going to run out of cocoa, and we're going to run out of people willing to grow it. And so companies started doing things about this. Governments actually at a certain moment also started doing things about it, but they all started doing different things. And for a very long time, we were talking about a sprint for people with no sense of direction. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not a negative, I'm not implying this negatively. In fact, we're trying to do something here that hasn't been done before, which is actually making a tropical commodity child labor free. Now, if you want to do something that hasn't been done before, then you're going to have to experiment, and you're going to have to fail, and you're going to have to actually find out some things do work and some things don't work. So this is actually fine. The problem is that when you don't do that together and you don't communicate about your feelings at a certain moment, it becomes very messy. And keeping this analogy of sprints down, I would suggest that in the last little while, we're coming to the point where this is a photograph of a real sprint, not a Monty Python sketch. A couple of years ago, a girl called Meghan Voghel was running second in a race, and the person right in front of her actually collapsed due to fatigue just inside of the finish line. And instead of running past her and winning the race, this lady, Meghan Voghel, picked up her competitor and supported her to finish together. Now, when we are talking about things as essential and as basic as the elimination of child labor, the elimination of trafficking in a supply chain, the elimination of poverty, then I would suggest this is the only way to go. It's not to run past your competitor and try to get a bigger market share off the back of trafficking or child labor or poverty. It's to pick this up and to work together. Now, that's what we're starting to see in the last couple of years, so to say, year and a half or two. You're seeing this within the ICI, who, when they got founded, actually were used as an excuse to be part of the 100-meter sprint for deaf people, but in the meantime, in the last 4 or 5 years, have really become one of the exemplary best practices in the sector, showing how things can be done, sharing information, and publicly bringing that forward. Another thing is that in the last 2 years, the 10 biggest chocolate companies have started to work together under something called Cocoa Action, which is pre-competitive collaboration, trying to share things, and one of the core focuses within that is the elimination of child labor. Now, all of this is sounding as if there is progress being made, and there really, really is. But at the same time, we also have a challenge, and that challenge is best illustrated probably using an Indiana Jones scene. Now, Indiana Jones, the film, sorry guys, I might be showing my age here, but as a young boy, this was my hero growing up in the 80s. At a certain moment in one of the films, Indiana Jones comes to this market in Egypt, and he's trying to catch some bad guys. And at a certain moment, there's this huge bad guy with a massive sword and starts looking like he's going to really kill Indiana Jones. And Indiana Jones looks at him, shrugs, grabs the gun out of his holster and shoots him down. And it feels sometimes that we might be involved in this scene in the cocoa sector. Last year, actually, the Department of Labor financed a report, actually in the follow-up of the Harkin-Engel Protocol and the Harkin-Engel Framework, finance report saying, how are we doing 15 years down the line on child labor? And the report was not very optimistic, to say the least. it wasn't also very clear, but the clearest message we can get out of that report is that child labor still is a huge problem in the cocoa sector. Now, how is this possible after 15 years of media attention, after almost 10 years of actually companies doing something about it? Well, I think it simply is because as a sector, collectively, we have brought a knife to a gunfight. We are nowhere near providing solutions that are the size of the problem when we're tackling or trying to tackle child labor. And this is where the core of the problem comes into, if you ask me. What we're not looking at is the drivers of child labor. Why are these kids in the worst forms of child labor in the cocoa plantations? I would suggest that one of the reasons is awareness. And once again, you can see here, that's a green letter. I think we're working on the awareness, and we've got solutions that are working quite well. And in fact, Olivier was just sharing some of the things that within the ICI work on that level. And in fact, the child labor monitoring and remediation systems are actually working to some extent on that as well. But what we're not doing is we're not actually tackling two of the core drivers towards child labor and the worst forms of child labor, which are a lack of decent livelihoods for cocoa farmers and an insufficient infrastructure ensuring a capacity to not have these kids actually work. We aren't tackling the core issues. Now, let me just give you one graph here. I tend to not like a lot of graphs. I tend to not like a lot of words in my presentations, but just to show you this is a research we released last year looking at income per cocoa farmers in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana. Now, if you look at the top line, you're looking at Cote d'Ivoire, the 50 cents, the brown part, that's the actual income that cocoa farmers are earning per dependent per day in Cote d'Ivoire is our calculation. They would need a 250% increase to get to $1.25 a day, which until a couple of months ago was considered the extreme poverty line, but that's just gone up to $1.90. So they'd need to see an almost 400% increase of income to even just reach the extreme poverty line now. In Ghana, it's slightly less drastic, but there's still a massive issue there. So unless we can start tackling some of these core issues around the income part of the cocoa sector, child labor will remain a massive problem and will be endemic in your supply chain. Now, the second thing that we're not dealing with properly has got to do with the with a substandard or a non-existent infrastructure. When we talk about issues such as, are there schools? Are these schools good? Are these schools staffed by teachers? Is there enough material for the schools to do? If there's no school in the village, the chance that a child will actually end up in child labor is huge. If there is no access to healthcare, all of these things actually frustrate the concept of taking children out of the cocoa supply chain. Now, just eliminating the problem, or actually reducing child labor in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana to a 70-80% reduction, which is now part of the follow-up of the Harkin-Engel framework and protocol, just reaching that, the ICI has actually said, would probably cost $500 to $600 million a year, just in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Now, the funding of all of the sustainability projects in the whole sector together aren't even that large, and most of those are focused on increasing productivity, which helps the companies and not necessarily helps the farmers as much. In fact, we are bringing a knife to a gunfight here, because not just on the child labor thing, but if you look at the whole thing that is needed to make a cocoa a sustainable supply chain, we're going to need to see an increase of the funding of the sector from about 250, 500 million a year in total to 5 billion to 10 billion a year. Now, in this picture that you see here, green is currently our estimation of the investments that the sector is putting into the cocoa supply chain. Pink is what it should be. Now that seems like a lot, but brown is
I'm sorry, if you could wrap up in a minute. We have a lot of questions queued up, which are brilliant. Your presentation.
I'm exactly 30 seconds from the end, so
okay,
yeah.
keep going.
So brown is the financial power of the whole sector coming from these countries. So here's the thing. Yes, we can achieve this. We can actually start bringing a gun to a gunfight if we want to, but it would require a lot more ambition than where we are at the moment. Now, having said that, I am finished. So thank you.
Sorry, Anthony, for stealing your last second there and interrupting you. That was an excellent presentation.
No problem.
And very much appreciate the economic analysis. I mean, I think we have all recognized, those who's working in the human trafficking sector, that just going with social responsibility and its importance for human rights is rarely convincing, but actually looking at the financing behind it and how we can structure these things to be commensurate to the capacity of companies to engage is very important. I have a number of questions that have come in from the panelists, from the audience. I'm going to give you 2 at a time, if you don't mind, and then we'll open up to whoever wants to respond. The first comes from Shabira Sultana, who unfortunately also had to go to bed because she came in from Bangladesh. She's working with World Vision and doing child labor and education issues, but finding it very hard to build up engagement. She's finding it very hard to find it convincing to convince private sector companies to sign up, and so is grateful for advice from the panel on strategies that could incentivize private sector to engage that might be relevant to Bangladesh. And I would also like you to please consider the following question, which is around the question of remediation and enforcement. What the participant wants to know is, how is ICI working with governments in dealing with child labor issues? Are there any sustainability plans to transfer monitoring systems to the government? And how do you ensure enforcement? I open back to our panel.
Yes, hi, it's Olivier speaking. If there's a question directly related to ICI, maybe I could start with this one. And are there plans for a sustainable monitoring and remediation system to be put in place, with handing that over to the government? But I would say that maybe the premise under that question is the difficulty there as well. Because in Côte d'Ivoire and in Ghana, as you might be aware, the government spending ability is not that great. And so relying solely on the government to put in place such systems is actually what will make it very difficult to have something sustainable, while private sector and multinational companies working in some of those countries have the financial means and the brand image, consumer social responsibility to actually do something and address this issue. And therefore, I think that only if those work together, there will be a possibility of sustainable child labor monitoring and remediation system. And I'm speaking solely on smallholder family farm agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, and that doesn't relate to an industry, a garment company in Bangladesh. That's a complete different story and a different engagement structure, where labor inspectors could very much, target that issue, do the work, and refer to existing social services. But in Côte d'Ivoire and in Ghana, with more than 500 or 600,000 farms in very remote rural areas, I don't believe that without harnessing the power and the capacity of private sector companies, any of those systems would be sustainable.
Thank you, Olivier. I don't know, Anthony, if you want to pick up maybe on the question on inciting companies to engage with you as a civil society organization?
Probably we're not the right organization to give the best answer to that. Some of our members obviously work very closely together with companies. We, as a Voice Network, make it because our job is to do advocacy and research, to make it a point to specifically not engage in projects together with companies. But we find that probably the best way to actually have the right dialogue with companies and to want them to kind of collaborate you with on various issues is to just remain kind of constructive but critical, and to remain fact-based. And we find that very often, I mean, there are very few topics that are so emotional and evocative as child labor. Everyone has this visceral gut feeling about it. And in that, child labor is bad enough as it is. And so we have found that it's very useful to, let the fact be the fact, because they're bad enough as they are. And though we are critical, we have found that the industry and also the governments, generally speaking, will judge us as a very fair organization. We're not always easy to work together with, but we are fair. And the things we say usually are well researched, and we find that really often is the very first point. Now, there's one point that I think has not really been mentioned yet, and I think is particularly useful within the context of this call that is about kind of child labor but also trafficking, is that in the last years I would suggest that the child labor monitoring and remediation systems that Olivier has mentioned have started to be a very clear best practice in finding child labor. In fact, they're actually finding child labor at the levels that we know that are there, but for example certification auditing isn't finding. And they are going to be necessary to put in there. However, I think that what we're starting to see, or at least the question that's starting to be raised here, is these child labor monitoring and remediation systems are working very well on the conditional worst forms of child labor. Among other reasons, I think because conditional worst forms of child labor require a different kind of intervention than the unconditional ones. With conditional worst forms of child labor, your intervention, as Olivier rightly said, is you come alongside the families where this is happening, and you look at how can you actually improve the situation of the families to ensure that this does not happen again. You increase their income, you improve their access to school, you increase their awareness, things like that. However, when you find unconditional worst forms of child labor, like trafficking and forced labor, there is actually a different set of interventions that is necessary often. That does require involving judicial systems quite quickly, because it clearly violates and is a crime. Now, that means that child labor monitoring and mediation systems that are based in the community can actually, there's actually the incentive to be found in the child labor monitoring and mediation system is actually going to get better. There is, within those, still, we're not quite sure, an incentive to find the unconditional worst forms. And so that might still be something that we're really trying to find the solutions for. I just thought it was an important point to make here. It hasn't been said yet, but it does put a nuance on there that the interventions possible also make it different as to how easy it is to find the transgressions taking place.
Thank you, Anthony. Pilar, I don't know if you want to chip in there on either of those questions.
Yeah, so I have two suggestions. One is I agree with Anthony. So the best way to talk about these issues is by using data. So perhaps Chavira could use even a report on the findings on the worst forms of child labor, because it includes information about Bangladesh. I also think then it would be, I don't know whether she has done it already or not, is to engage with other organizations that work on child labor issues, such as the International Labor Organization, or perhaps UNICEF, and of course the government. So that would be one of the ideas is really engaging with different actors. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you. I'm going to take another two questions, again grouped together because they're quite similar. They look at the line between informality and moving situations of informal labor into situations that are trafficking in the classic and criminal sense. So the first one asks whether or not the risk of reducing family farm child labor increases the risk of trafficking, because parents have a greater incentive to sell their children if they can't use them for labor at home. The second question asks to what extent criminal organizations are involved in child labor, because it appears that child labor is also linked to local uses under the pressure of the market, and difficult economic situations. Perhaps, Pilar, since you went last, you might want to go first in terms of response to this one.
Yes, so I can say two things. One is we see that there is one of the issues when we think about child labor is that in many cases child labor could lead to forced labor or other forms of labor exploitation. And we have seen that through projects that we have been funding in other countries, like for example in Brazil, where we have victims of forced labor. Then they previously were engaged in child labor. So regarding the question whether it would be a link between informality and trafficking, is a possibility, but I would say that something that is really important is it depends on the context and the situation. So I would say that is something really important to think about it, and informality in what sectors. Regarding children engaged in criminal organizations, through our projects and through our research, we have seen that there is a growing number of children engaged in criminal activities. There are a lot of children, for instance, in Latin America, then they are engaged in drug trafficking. There are children who are being recruited by gangs in Central America to conduct criminal activities. One of the things then I wanted to mention is that we are currently funding a project in Central America, specifically in El Salvador and Honduras, where we are looking into this issue. We in our project in Colombia then focus on gold mining and coal and gold mining. We also in areas where when there is gold mining, in some cases there is child recruitment. So one of the things in our projects do is to prevent child labor, but these working with children who are engaged in criminal activities require very specific strategies and interventions, and that requires working with law enforcement agencies.
Thank you, Pilar, very much. Is there anybody else on the panel who wanted to speak to these questions?
This is Olivier from ICI. Just on the risk, I like the question because it also demonstrates that it is a wicked problem. It is not that easy. And you know, if I was to use the same metaphor that Antonie has, it's not just about the gunfight against another less developed weapon. It's more also about there is no silver bullet. And I think that's also what happened very much at the beginning of the fight against child labor, is that people thought, especially in the business world as well, where you usually, you have an issue, you pay someone, and then that issue is solved, that understanding that you can solve that very easily and that there is a silver bullet, there is none. And in fact, there is a potential risk for that, that if you play around and turn a little bit that side of the cock, then something else will move and create a problem somewhere else. So it's a very complex issue. Specifically on this risk, I'm not aware of any study or research that would show that. From our results in our CLMRS, we haven't seen that would be an issue, that because farmers felt they could not use their own kids in the cocoa production, they would then sell them and basically traffic them to other sectors. At ICI, and that's a little bit the revolution that happened with the CLMRS versus certification, is that we use a supportive approach towards addressing child labor, not a punitive, which means that in some way a farmer who admits to using its own kids will receive more support than one that has not been using them because he's in a different situation or he requires less support maybe. So I don't believe that with such an approach that would necessarily generate that. And also it needs to be said that we do not just conduct farm visits, but also visit the household. And if a child disappears from the farm and is used in the household for something else, or we realize that that child is then being exploited on a rubber plantation on the other side of the village, then that is still very much within the realm of our intervention, and we would follow that. So I hope this provides some answer to the question.
Thank you, Olivier. Antonie, anything from your research?
Well, I think that what Olivier said is exactly right. I think that about 10, 15 years ago, we were all looking at magic bullets that would solve the whole problem. And to be honest, I think for a long time we thought certification was that. In fact, when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem starts looking like a nail very quickly. And I think that when you try to do a renovation with only a hammer, in the end you'll end up with something broken instead of something fixed. And I think that the only magic bullet out there is to make sure that you've got a very well-equipped toolbox where you use the right tool for the right purpose. And child labor monitoring and remediation systems are part of that. I think certification is still a very important tool because it helps you actually bring your supply chain into clarity. It helps you actually know who and where you're coming from. I think that there are certain issues that we are totally not tackling with yet that do still need to be dealt with, and some of those really revolve around the livelihoods of the farmers. You know, how in a neoliberal world can you start talking about increasing the livelihood of smallholders where you're not allowed to talk about price? This is a problem because a smallholder is not a wage earner. He's a small entrepreneur, so to speak. So, you know, those are complexities, but we need to have a fully informed and a nuanced conversation, whilst at the same time understanding that child labor is something that consumers and people care about, because we have all been children.
Good point, indeed. I'm going to take the last two questions I think we're going to have time for this evening. The first comes from Mike McDonnell, who says, and it's directed at you, Antonie, if the cocoa industry moves from green to red, being a cynic for a moment, would that mean that there are fewer workers available, or is there some chance for, and as silly as it may sound, automation? The second question comes from Abby McGill. It says, in our research with farmers in Cote d'Ivoire on the ground, they mentioned that with a labour shortage in rural areas and low cocoa prices, they're not able to afford farm labour and thus have to find labourers from neighbouring countries. We've also heard some anecdotal evidence that child trafficking has increased at the Cote d'Ivoirian as the Cote d'Ivoirian order is demilitarized, but that wasn't really researched in the Tulane report. Do any of the speakers have insight on child trafficking onto Cote d'Ivoirian cocoa plantations and how cocoa farmers can improve waged labour on the smallholder plantations? Okay, since one was directed at Antonie and we finished with you, we'll go back to you and then pass to the other two.
To do first or last? Sorry, I missed that for a minute there.
Antonie, why don't you go first with the answer directed at you of the shifting of cocoa from green to red and automation?
This is actually a big discussion in the cocoa sector at the moment, and in West Africa there is very little automation. You're starting to and it's all smallholder based. In Latin America, you're starting to see very, very large scale plantations being set up, and in fact, Mars just recently bought a very large one in Ecuador just 3 or 4 weeks ago as an experimental phase. Now, you can't fully automate it. There is kind of an improvement you can do as far as efficiency is concerned, and yes, we're going to have to see efficiency in any case. The availability of sufficient labor is a problem. Technology is not going to solve that because the technology is in and of itself also very expensive and requires yields that are very, very high. And at the moment, that's going to, you know, there are places where people are arguing that it works. There are places that people are arguing that it doesn't work. If, however, you approach this from a human rights perspective and not from a kind of end purchaser's perspective, that's almost irrelevant to the problem of child labor, because if the farms would, if these farms would stop being cocoa farms in West Africa because they're too small to be tenable in cocoa, then the problem of child labor and abuse would probably shift to a different commodity, but be at the same farm. So that's part of the answer. It is tricky. There is a big debate going on about it, but it doesn't solve the problem of the lack of a livelihood. Now, this is not just in cocoa, it's endemic to agriculture throughout the world. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, this cartoonist in Iowa was fired for making a cartoon where these two farmers were standing next to each other saying, kind of, if only there was profit in farming. And then the other farmer said, there is. The CEOs of the large food companies are earning a lot of money. There is a value distribution part of this as well, and there is also, to a large extent, a kind of a how much are we willing to pay for our products part of this. A report released just 3 weeks ago in the Netherlands said that basically a ton of cocoa should be 5 times as expensive to cover the costs of poverty in the cocoa supply chain. So yes, it might be that there isn't sufficient kind of affordable adult labor, and in fact that is the case, but that's because we think that kind of the hidden costs of child labor make it more affordable, and we need to get to a place where that no longer happens. And then when we're talking about roles and responsibilities there, that's something that governments really need to take into account, because companies are not going to be able to demand a higher price collectively because of antitrust law. Individually, this is going to be hard because they'll price themselves out of the market. So this is where governments specifically have an important role to play in our perspective. I'm going to round there. I mean, I can talk about this for 2 days, so I'm going to end here.
Thanks. Sorry. Very much. Does anybody to the question of child trafficking and waged labor and the cross-border issues?
So maybe on wage labor, just to note that, and I wish my colleague Cheryl would be able to speak on the panel, because she's been managing that research for the past few months. And just to indicate to interested panelists that the research will be available on the ICIcocoinitiative.org website in the next 1 to 2 weeks, where we've conducted an analysis in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and tried to assess exactly that, to see is there a shortage, or is the price the issue of the labor? And we've got some very interesting findings, but it's very difficult to summarize and to mention that within just 1 minute, because it relates to so many different variables, and the situation is very different in Ghana and in Cote d'Ivoire. So just to encourage you to look at the website in maybe about 2 weeks, and you'll see that very interesting research report there.
Well, Olivier, it would be great if you would take time to share it with Christina and I, and then we can send it on when we send out the promotional material for the next webinar. I'm sure that will meet with great interest.
I'll definitely do that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So, Pilar, just a last, do you have anything that you want to add to those 2 questions before I give you all a chance for the last words before we close?
No, I think I don't need to. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So, well, then, Pilar, since we have you now, we are going to wrap up this webinar. We don't have any more questions from our participants. I do want to thank you all for a very rich discussion. Is there anything you would like to say before we close? I maybe give you each 2 minutes to reflect back on the issues that we've discussed.
Yeah, so I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. One thing that I wanted to mention is then I really like I wanted to mention that we think that we want people to join our efforts here at the U.S. Department of Labor to reduce child labor, and we encourage people to get involved, to use our reports, to have conversations with different actors, to use our app as a tool to raise awareness. One of the things then I also wanted to say is that Christina mentioned that her students are developing business solutions or potential business solutions for the families and to tackle child labor. So one of the things that I wanted to say is it's great that they want to do it, and they could do it according to the context and how these vulnerable families, where you find these children working. Lastly, I would like to say that for everybody who is part of this discussion, then think that many of the products or things that we wear, we use, have been made by people, and perhaps some of them were children, and perhaps some of those things or products were done under poor labor conditions. So think about it and get involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilar, for that great call for action and engagement. Antonie, any last words from you?
Yes, I think child labor in supply chains, I mean, we looked a lot at cocoa today, but there's a lot of lessons to be learned in other things. For me, it's a particularly important topic because it's the reason 10 years ago I got involved in the cocoa sector and I got involved in sustainability in a general thing. I think that if there's one thing that we have learned in the cocoa sector in the last decade of struggling with this topic, it's the fact that it requires everyone's effort. It requires everyone's participation. And that when you use the word shared responsibility, it doesn't mean pointing your finger at the other and saying, but they should be doing more. But shared responsibility should in the first place be looking at what can I be doing more. And I would go so far as to say that unless we really start bringing the same size solutions to the size of this problem, we're going to be doing this mostly so that we can feel good instead of that we can solve the problem. Unless our solutions are commensurate to the size of the problem, we're not going to win this thing. And that is something that I don't think any of us want.
Thanks, Antonie, for another good call to action and for everybody to get engaged. Olivier?
Yes, very difficult to come after Antonie and Pilar when both the complexity of the issue and a call for action were issued. But maybe to say this in a different way, when we talk about human rights in supply chain, because we say supply chain, we automatically push responsibility towards multinational enterprise and the business sector. And sometimes I think we can forget that unless the government is also playing its part and the social services that are available, and the Ministry of Education is building schools, infrastructures, roads, markets available, and until you have economic growth within that country that allows for all of that to happen, and until you have consumers that are actually willing to look at the label of the products that they buy, and that they are not just saying in studies that they would indeed prefer to buy a chocolate bar that has no child labor, but in the same study 2 questions later are that schizophrenic to say, but I'm not willing to pay a cent for that same chocolate bar. I think until all of that is being taken into consideration into this complexity, then the problem will not be solved. And so this is a call for action for all of us as consumers to look at those bars and be ready to pay a bit more for that chocolate. But also to look at the problem in its complexity and not to be too naive to think that only one sector can deal with that issue on its own, and that it really requires a lot of will, a lot of effort, a lot of funds from all actors really involved.
Thank you so much, Olivier. I think that's also a very good point. For us now, I think we've reached the end of this discussion. I mean, if I could say that my key takeaways from this, which were very useful and specific to the cocoa industry, but I think also replicable around other forms of informal labor which tend to exploit the use of children or heavily rely on the use of children. I mean, what we heard from all of the presenters is the importance of continuing to raise this issue around finding credible formalization alternatives, whilst at the same time recognizing these are very interdependent issues and that messing with informal industries can create more problems if proper viable alternatives are not found. That the importance of credible research and having it sharing it can put some motivation behind an issue, and it can also be used as a catalyst to get other sectors involved and private sectors to engage. I mean, a number of you mentioned and emphasized the need for this to be a multi-stakeholder initiative. I mean, clearly from individual consumers through to the gamut, as we had on our panel today, of governmental, intergovernmental, civil society and the private sector have to respond together in an integrated way, and we need to think through how we do this coherently with a strategic response rather than a scattershot manner. And that there are a number of levers to be deployed, that we have the social welfare issues, we have the economic issues, we have the trade issues, we have the overall economic climate that we would have to address. So again, a very complex problem, very rich panoply of solutions put onto the table, and I think they're very useful. And I hope that those who have been listening have also found them of value. I'm going to wrap up our discussion now. We have our next webinar, which also on the 16th of June. It looks at lessons learned in auditing and training. So again, a very practical topic, looking at what, for those private sector institutions that have chosen to respond to issues of human trafficking, how they've done so, what they've done well, how they've disseminated and built a culture of human trafficking response in their corporations. I hope that you will all join in and join us and look out for our recordings and reports that come out. The report of our last year's webinar is actually up and available now on our website and on the Babson website, I believe. And I'll turn it back to Christina, I think, to close us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tuesday, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our dynamic panel of speakers, Pilar, Olivier, and Antonie, for doing such a tremendous job in giving us a real overview of the situation on child labor and child trafficking. We're so grateful for your participation. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us for the final 2 hours. And putting up with our technical challenges. We're deeply grateful for your time and interest in this, and we hope you'll join us for our next webinar, our 5th webinar in the series in June, and look for our notices as we send out a reminder for each of these webinars. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day and or evening. Take care. Bye-bye.